Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the energy future and how the oil and gas industry will lead. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. We're in a pivotal time, a time I'm calling the moment. Forces are conspiring to lay bare the reality that the energy transition is not going to be simple or easy or cheap. And that creates some real leadership opportunities for all of us. I am focusing on how our industry can seize this moment and lead into it through proactive and positive engagement. If you would like to learn more about the moment, I hope you'll subscribe to my newsletter. Both of these things are true on our Energy Thinks website. On today's show, I speak with John Dabbar. He's the managing director of low carbon technologies at ConocoPhillips. I wanted to talk to John because he recently led a multi-year effort to explore how the U.S. can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this was another National Petroleum Council study. You heard about another one on our last episode. I wanted to get his take because this is a significant undertaking and it has many points of connection to the moment. You can learn more about John's biography in our show notes. I think you'll enjoy hearing about, one, why do we need to focus on communicating and exploring with stakeholders the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also what surprised both John and I through the course of this study. I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with John Dabbar. John Dabbar, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Thinks podcast.
It's great to see you again, Tisha. Thanks.
I wanted to talk to you about the moment because you have this really cool position as managing director in the low carbon technology space. And also, I got to watch you lead the National Petroleum Council greenhouse gas study, which I have sitting on my shelf right behind me. And I'd like to take each of those in turn. Can you tell our audience first a little bit about the role you have at ConocoPhillips?
Yeah, so I'm in our low carbon technologies team. We have two main areas that we work on here. One is on decarbonizing our assets, our exploration and production business. And the other is on developing low carbon business opportunities that are adjacent to the skills that we have. I've been doing that for about 3 years. Before that, I worked in our public policy and government affairs team. And going way back, I was a union engineer, 10 years in a hard hat and coveralls, doing marine and offshore projects.
I loved reading about that in your background. You really have had quite a journey. And I think it's so interesting that you're working at ConocoPhillips in the low carbon technology space. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the critiques or concerns out in the world that we have a lot about the oil and gas industry working in this low tech space is, are you keeping your house in order? Are you managing your greenhouse gas emissions? Mm-hmm. And so it was maybe prescient, or, we'll see, we'll see, to have you lead this greenhouse gas emissions study for the National Petroleum Council. So can you talk a little bit about, tell us about that study, and why did Secretary Granholm ask the NPC to embark upon this massive endeavor?
Well, first, I've got to give a shout out to the career Department of Energy staff, because they really are our thought partners on what questions they should be asking and what questions the industry and the advisory council are able to answer and have sort of special knowledge that they can use to answer it. So it really goes back to sort of a give and take with the administration and with the career staff to say, here are questions you ought to think about. Here are known unknowns that would be useful in your policy making, your decision making, and also the career staff working with the administration to figure out what does the administration need to know to advance its goals. And so when we kind of find those two fitting together, that's where we come up with a study request letter. And that's what Secretary Granholm submitted to us. We then decided to take that one on.
It's you gave some actually really nice insight into the process, because I sit both on the National Petroleum Council, but I also got to serve on both studies, including your study. And that process, that letter that comes out from Secretary Granholm, it has, I can't remember, you'll know exactly how many, 7 questions or something. And these are not questions for the faint of heart. These are like big, hairy, challenging questions. And my last guest on the podcast was Austin Knight, who was your who's both of our colleague and who was leading the hydrogen study at the same time. Mm-hmm. I mean, heaven help us if we ever try to undertake two of these studies at the same time again. It was quite an endeavor. But we talked about what a huge undertaking it is. Mm-hmm. And I would love to hear what your experience was like. Like what were we talked about the huge number of participants in writing, stakeholders from out. I think the National Petroleum Council can be a little bit of a misnomer, right? When we undertake these efforts, and what you learned along the way about engaging with this huge group.
Mm-hmm. So very early on, I got some coaching from people that had worked on previous NPC studies, both from the private sector and from the DOE. And a part of the guidance I got was make sure that you have a diversity of views so that this does not come across as an oil and gas industry study under the rubric of NPC. NPC membership is roughly 50% not oil and gas industry. By design, that's as a federal advisory committee. And so, I actively recruited members from the NPC, but also asked them for input on who outside of the NPC can bring additional insights, contrarian views, make it a more robust study. So that's why, half of my study team were from academia, tribal organizations, think tanks, advocacy groups, individuals, large organizations, consultants, really a diverse group, as well as the other half that were oil and gas folks. And so that was really a way where we were able to very early on identify that this is not going to be just a rubber stamp of what the industry wants, but it's really going to be challenging both the advisory committee members and outsiders to come up with things where, as I said at a very early meeting, we want recommendations where nobody is completely comfortable. Mm-hmm. We would like everybody to be a little uncomfortable, difficult, challenging, because then we know that we've pushed beyond something simple and we've moved into the things that are difficult but important.
Well, John, you're describing a process. First, there's this thoughtful iteration around the study questions, and then there's I got to talk to you when you were putting together your team, and you were just extraordinarily thoughtful about not just who would be at the table, but how it would be received later. How would these results be received? And now you're describing, I think, a really important process of wrestling down to these recommendations. And sometimes you hear this sort of people say this sort of lazy thing, like, if no one's happy, then we're doing our job right. That's not what you did. This was, if everyone is feeling stretched to view the world from a broader set of perspectives, if everyone is feeling stretched to make recommendations that are challenging to address, then we're doing our job right. I just want to really compliment your leadership and also compliment the participants who spend hundreds of hours. This isn't like a sloppy, lazy compromise. This is like the most nuanced, like tortured set of smart recommendations that you're going to find in a process like that. I'm complimenting you, so hopefully you'll agree, but also, like, do you think I got that right? Like, what was your experience of getting there?
So really the approach was first to listen and understand, not just what somebody said, which is in some cases either the headline or it's a pull quote from their company website or it's in their latest advocacy letter, but really understand what is the underlying concern. What do they see as the root cause, not just the symptom? So it was really listening to understand. The second was to really push inclusive communications. To really seek out the people that aren't saying much, because when they say something, it's going to be important, and making sure that kind of the view of consensus is when everybody has had sufficient input that they feel that their concerns are included in the final outcome. And then the last one was in terms of the actual process of doing it, we've all done a lot of virtual meetings. It's really hard to have conflict resolution in a virtual meeting. So one of the things I set up early on was I said, we're going to have a mandatory day and a half every month, face-to-face. You are expected to be there. Please commit to that. And we use the face-to-face meetings for those kind of one-on-one discussions to really get into, I know you don't want to talk about this in front of everybody, but let's drill into it. Or personal trips by me to NPC member offices to have one-on-one meetings with their leadership to help them get comfortable with what we were trying to do, but also, peel through what are you really concerned about that we can help deliver. So a lot of it was, simplistically, it was active listening skills and active conflict resolution activity. The sort of, the day in and day out of that was a lot of time and effort.
There's so many gifts in what you're describing, John, because in the work ahead, which we'll talk about, in the work ahead and the recommendations from the report, we in industry, and around industry, we have to be better at figuring out how to see the world from more perspectives and then engage in this kind of really diplomacy, right? That will allow us the opportunities and challenges ahead for the energy system are significant. And these listening skills, these conflict resolution skills you're describing, these diplomatic endeavors, these are the work of our industry. These are the work of our energy leaders ahead. And so it's so cool that I actually had never thought about it before this moment, that NPC is doing us a service in training us to do this well, training us to build these relationships. And I can speak from experience that once you've walked across the 24 months of NPC study calls with people, you have relationships for life. Like there is no going back. So thank you for your work on that.
No,
so I want to take this into this idea of a moment where civic leaders around the world, here domestically in North America, they're thinking more pragmatically about the energy future. They're thinking about what it's going to really take to address climate, because energy transition is harder than maybe what many of us first thought. It's gonna require all of us. And one of the, I think, opportunities of the moment is that civic leaders who might simplistically have not imagined a place for the natural gas industry in the U.S. Are going to understand the role. So I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about some of the NPC findings about how the natural gas industry in the U.S. is important to addressing greenhouse gas emissions globally. And what are some of the things that you recommend that we as an industry do to get after those opportunities?
So we really broke down the recommendations into 5 major categories. One is around measurement and verification of emissions, the societal impacts, both benefits and community engagement. I'll come back to that one in a moment. Incentives for GHG abatement investments, and really abatement is really the key. It's not just about measuring emissions, it's about eliminating and reducing and eliminating emissions. The importance of regulatory effectiveness and durable policy, and then specifically industry and operator actions. We made a lot of recommendations on things that industry should be doing, not being told to do by a regulator, but we should go out and do these things. And I'll give you a couple of really interesting examples. And it was a real learning for me because in my previous work at ConocoPhillips, I was actually responsible for our stakeholder engagement team. But it was very specific. It was our company business at our company locations and communities. But through the course of the study, and thanks to you and your team at the admin team for contributing to this, I learned a lot about sort of the global concerns and the global opportunities around the U.S. for industry to better engage with communities. And one of the 2 of the key takeaways, one was going back to the way we ran our study. It's really listen to the community. As one of my friends from a tribal organization said, John, when you've met with one tribe, you now know one tribe. and you really need to understand what is important to that community, because this is the other important learning, that community has a history with the oil and gas industry that you may not know anything about. It may not even be with your company. But if you don't know that history, you are completely unable to help address the concerns generated by that history. So those are kind of the two important things around societal impacts and community engagement. I mentioned industry and operator actions. Very early on in the study, we brought on board a large number of small operators, people that aren't members of the National Petroleum Council. And in one case, it was a guy that literally owns one well. So we wanted to make sure that we got these small operator concerns incorporated really early on. And we made recommendations for things that broadly help the industry on actions, but would target small operators and the thousands of small operators around the country to help them on their emissions reduction journey. Those are kind of the two big areas that I wanted to make sure I brought to your attention.
There's so much interesting that comes out of this report. One is, out in the world, there can be a preconceived notion that the oil and gas industry is anti-regulation, anti-greenhouse gas emission reduction. When you read the recommendations of this study, you cannot help but come to the conclusion, wait, is this an industry? This is an industry that is making the case for more engagement. This is an industry that's making a case for regulation that drives the kind of outcomes you're looking for, predictable, actionable. So I think there's sort of a theme of embracing the nuance in these questions, in these answers. And I hadn't thought about what you just said about the small operators, because I was working so intently with the group doing on the community side of things. But a really important pushback to a lot of industry engagement and decarbonization does come from the small operators that say we can't afford to do this. And so having a place for their interests and concerns to be voiced is it's quite novel, and I think it's quite important, because that's representative of a even greater share of America, right? Of the parts of our industry that say this is hard, this is expensive, and it's unpredictable. And bringing all of us together to understand those things so we can address them is really quite unique. I want to talk a little bit about what you learned from those outside of industry, in addition to the community feedback was so interesting and important. And I'll just, again, give the whole process a nod to the focus groups done, the traveling that was done to all around the country, the engagement with many communities to get their feedback. So some who are skeptical of the oil and gas industry's commitment to emissions reductions will say, look, getting your own house in order, reducing your emissions is simply table stakes. Like, that's just the price of entry. Like, deal with your stuff. And as I participated in this study, I really came to understand just how wildly complex that table stakes component is. You mentioned measuring, you mentioned abatement. Like, there's just so many layers of complexity from the entire value chain. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned about those challenges and how we can maybe talk or think about them in constructive ways?
So one of the real interesting sort of and maybe surprising findings that we had was around the challenge in quantifying methane emissions. And I learned a lot from the scientists. We had a lot of both field tests and chalk talks from the scientists on the challenge of taking an emission and then measuring it, and then, sorry, I have to use math, time series, creating a time series, differentiating it over time, and then integrating it over a time and space to come up with an inventory. And the number of exogenous variables that go into that calculation. That we really came back to a concept of saying, rather than having a completely measured inventory of GHGs, it's really to have a measurement-informed inventory. Do enough measurement that you can say, I have reasonable assurance that this is the right amount that I am measuring, but more importantly, that I can measure deviations. I can measure unexpected changes, and therefore I can send somebody to react to it. And so that was really an important learning that came out of it. And that really goes back to the incentives for abatement. If you have an incentive to reduce your reportable and measured and reportable GHGs, then you can deploy people and resources and capital to actually do that. The other one that was really interesting to me was around the value of methane emissions elimination. And then, you've heard it said, I'm sure many times, that, well, methane is a valuable product, so why are you allowing it to leak out? Well, we were able to actually show through some really interesting analysis that in many cases, the value of gas emissions are higher than anybody expected when you actually value them and say, so it's really cost effective to do these things more than you thought. And there were some real light bulbs going on, going, wow, I never knew that, I never realized that, but now I can take that back to the boss and say, we need to mitigate our methane emissions in particular.
That's a really, there's a couple really interesting, important pieces in there. One is, I also learned through this process that I thought, again, that part of table stakes pre-study, I thought part of table stakes was, yeah, you want there was sort of this myth of continuous emissions monitoring. Like, we're going to know what's happening everywhere all the time. But what we have actually learned is that is almost impossible to do. And if you put the energy into that, you wouldn't be putting the energy into abating those emissions. And so I really like the takeaway that I think is becoming much more widely understood, this idea of measurement informed emissions understanding, and then use that to prioritize your abatement. It's so important because it's so complicated, and we could waste a lot of energy measuring things that we aren't abating. So I love where you got with that. So, and the second part that you were moving toward, which is like there is a real financial case to be made for managing methane emissions. I'm curious about some of the recommendations that came out of the report around what government needs to do, what stakeholders need to do, what industry needs to do to accelerate this abatement work, this emissions reductions. Can you talk about some of those that maybe you found the most compelling and actionable?
Yeah, I'll go back to some of our industry and operator actions. One of the recommendations we made is that the industry should and has a pathway to information sharing about learnings and best practices. And we found a role for trade associations, in particular the state trade associations that are sort of closest to those operators, to be the convening authority to share information about how to apply technology, how to use that technology best, what operator practices, operator trainings, what work practices are really effective in doing it. Because we all benefit if everybody knows those things. There's no advantage in having a lower emissions than other people in your basin, because the basin is the one that is criticized for having high emissions. So it's best if everybody knows these things and to give that information away freely. So we found a role for the trade associations.
As a former trade association executive, I want to just put an exclamation point on that, because I think trade associations can get caricatured as the lobbying pushback arm that has to represent those small operators we talked about. But giving trades a role to accelerate progress, to reduce costs, to crowdsource information is just such a constructive role that the members embrace. So it's a great recommendation.
On the government side, in addition to the great work that DOE does through the National Laboratories Program, there's measurement technology that's in the field right now that was invented through the National Laboratories Program. So you can see direct line of sight from DOE investment to field deployment of detection technologies. But another really important area that we took back to both regulators and legislators is the importance of durable policy. In order to attract capital investment on emissions reduction technologies and equipment, you really want to have policies that are likely to be the same over the life of that investment. And having them swing wildly from one side to the other, while sort of a fact of electoral politics, is something that we said it's really good to have them be consistent and not wildly swing from one side to the other. That will ensure, in many cases, the life of an investment is much longer than the life of the underlying regulation or legislation that started it. So those are kind of two areas that we really focused in on. We did make some recommendations for additional work by DOE to have a national convening authority similar to the Petroleum Technology Transfer Council that they used to have in DOE, sort of repurposing that for emissions reduction sharing. And we made a recommendation for DOE through the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to do additional study work on societal impacts and community engagement, sort of writ large, not from an oil and gas sector standpoint, but sort of a much broader analysis of that.
It's encouraging that after this multi-year, hundreds of stakeholder engagement, the recommendations encourage more engagement, more collaboration, more work across government, stakeholders, NGOs, academics, because the challenges ahead of us are worthy of that level of collaboration. But it is, I don't think we should take it for granted that we didn't all just walk away and go, huh, that was hard, let's never do that again. In fact, we need more collaboration, and we need bigger tents. We need bigger tents to get this work done. I'm wondering, John, after spending so much of your life working on this, is there anything that came out of the Petroleum Council in recommendations or findings that surprised you?
Yeah, I'll go back to the challenge of quantification. Very early on, we got the message from the DOE folks that there was an expectation of lots and lots of quantification, and they asked us to really to look into that. And we got the experts to the table, and a diversity of experts. These were, in some cases, they were people. Well, I'll give you a statistic. During the course of the study, the people working on the study published 219 peer-reviewed technical papers on methane emission reductions and quantification. So we had
Squad. You had the Geek Squad on the case.
Yeah. And so that was a real surprise to me. It was I went from junior varsity to, I'd say, sort of World Series level of knowledge in that during that time.
I'm glad you raised that one, because I think it speaks to this idea of actually the moment that we have there are some, maybe overstates it, but there are some expectations that some things are going to be straightforward, like quantify everything, that are not straightforward. There's very real technical challenges, not just economic or scale challenges, and working on the details matters to get this right. Because the myth of something being easy means we're underestimating the work ahead, and that means we're not going to be successful. So I'm really glad that you dove into that.
There was another interesting part of that, which was from folks outside of the industry, a bit of skepticism about why industry didn't just do it, to use that phrase. Why don't you just get after it? Why do you need to get incentives? Why do you need to get support from the government? Why can't you just solve the problem on your own? And having to kind of work through even things as simple as net present value calculations, and why people invest in things, and what are the market forces. And this was another really interesting surprise for me. I've worked on a number of NPC studies. Every one of them in the past has had a very specific finding. You need a carbon tax. Full stop. No further discussion needed. We got challenged by the study leadership, the NPC members, to say, don't give us just that simple answer again, but rather go through the market mechanisms and lay out a broad array of market mechanisms, ones that you know about, ones that have worked, ones that maybe don't work, and go through the pros and cons of those so that people can read them and make an informed decision about market mechanisms that can work well if well designed and fail if poorly designed. So we gave a much more fulsome discussion rather than just a single point source answer.
I think what you're saying, we need to update the devils in the details to like the angels are in the details. Like the salute, like the path to success is through the very geeky assessments of what we need to, what we are going to need to succeed. So I commend you on the detailedness of this endeavor.
Okay.
I want you talked about there are many participants in NPC studies who are generally skeptical of the industry. It's one of the things that makes the work so much stronger. You also came out of stakeholder engagement. You led this process and with a lot of, I think, intentionality. What could you tell our audience about what you've learned about how to engage with skeptics of our industry, and how has it informed the work that you do?
Well, first, I'd encourage all of your listeners to listen to your previous podcast on trust with Naomi Boness. I think that was a very well done and really resonated with me. And I also will just point out some people will always dislike the oil and gas industry. I'm not here to change their minds. If they do, that's great. That's a great outcome. But if they at least understand and listen, that's a win. And I'll also point out, and I always like this Bill Clinton quote, which is, you need to take criticism seriously, but not personally. Because if you take it personally, then you're unable to sort out what's valid and what's not. So, listening to the folks that were sort of inherently skeptical was a learning experience, because, I had my frame. I know what our company does. But there were people that are skeptical of oil and gas that have bad examples that may be from the past, they may be from other countries, but they're examples that they have seen. And so learning about that helped me understand that's why you feel that way. And so it was a really good learning experience to have that broad input, not just about my company, but about our industry.
Thank you for that insight. Well, one, I love that quote. That's going up, or that's going to be added around my monitor somewhere. It's so important, because the work we're doing here, we're all trained as scientists and engineers, but the work we're doing now is so much about building trust, creating connections, and not overreacting or reacting in ways that are unhelpful to these critiques. So I like the idea that we can be deeply respectful of the critique without actually letting it sort of, hit in too personal a way. And yet the flip side that you also invoked, John, is that we are listening to the personal side of what people are saying as well. Like we're seeking to understand a little bit about where they're coming from, which also makes it less personal. Like they're speaking from their own experience, and
Right.
we don't need to have a strong reaction to that. I have a final question for you that I ask all my guests. John, what are you most optimistic about?
So one of the pleasures of working on this report was I worked with a lot of early career innovators, people that were doing really creative things, a lot of STEM creatives that were, doing some great stuff on science and technology, but in a lot of different ways where they were innovating, not just on developing new technologies, but developing algorithms, developing different business models, looking at new ways of doing things from a work practice standpoint, training standpoint. So those kind of innovations that were brought to the table, that makes me really optimistic, because those early career innovators are the future of our industry.
Amazing. And the amazing thing too about innovating an algorithm is you're innovating something that will be repeatable, and therefore scalable. And so it's so exciting. And only on the Energy Things podcast can two geeks be optimistic about algorithm innovation. John, I want to thank you. It was an honor to observe your very thoughtful leadership of this study. And I think we as an industry, we as the National Petroleum Council are lucky to have you as a leader. And so thank you for your leadership there. And thank you for your work with ConocoPhillips. And thank you for joining me on the Energy Things podcast.
Thank you very much, Tisha.
That's our episode for today. You've been listening to Energy Things. I want to thank John Dabbar for joining me. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for allowing me to have so many interesting and cool conversations. The thing I'm going to take away from that conversation is the quote about taking critiques seriously, but not personally. It's a very powerful way to think about the work that we do. Sometimes the emotional and intellectual toll it can take on us. I hope you're finding these conversations compelling and that you'll take a moment to rate and review this podcast. It will help others in industry find us. If you'd like to know more about our work at Adamantine, please visit energythinks.com. And while you're there, I hope you will sign up for my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I would like to thank Kayla Chives for making the Energy Thinks podcast possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.